Some of the most interesting companies to study are privately held organizations, such as law firms, consulting firms, accounting firms, and even entrepreneurial organizations that haven't yet published their financials and are sort of still in bootstrapping mode. Okay? How do you actually analyze them when the numbers are hard to find? Well, the key here is to be creative, is to try to find a way to measure the return on invested capital in these organizations. I mean, one straightforward thing to do is to try to come up with some estimate of return on sales. Usually with these organizations, it's difficult to come up with an asset number for two reasons. One is they're not yet published or they haven't been published. And then the second is that many of these professional or privately held organizations don't have booked assets. They're very labor-intensive organizations. Think of a law firm. A law firm typically doesn't own a lot of assets. It runs on salaries. So it often makes sense to look at return on sales here. What you need is some measure of the difference between revenues and costs in order to be able to calculate return on sales. The returns, of course, are the difference between revenues and costs, and then the denominator in the return on sales calculation are those revenues. So you're looking at profits over revenues when you make that calculation. Some ways that people sometimes have accomplished this in the past are to look at things like profits per partner at a law firm. Sometimes you can even come up with some estimate of the salaries of lawyers in a particular geography and compare that to some number you can get on revenues. You have the number of lawyers in the firm, you have the average salary, and then you have the revenue number. That allows you to estimate the difference between revenues and costs for a law firm, for example. Now, what if you can't even find those numbers? What if you're completely at a loss? You can't come up with any sort of revenue number whatsoever. Well, you can try to come up with proxies. You can look at, let's say, the number of offices of a professional services firm. You can try to estimate revenues by looking at some sort of average for revenues per office and multiply that number by the number of offices. Ultimately, you've got to get creative here. What we're interested in doing is comparing a particular business unit to its peer group in terms of total return on invested capital. And I'm open to pretty much any creative mechanism for making that comparison. You know, in some instances, I've had students who, will compare, tuition dollars per student for a particular school with rival schools to estimate differences in revenues, and then numbers of teachers per student as an estimate of costs. I'm open to any creative approach that you can find to estimate these numbers. So the first goal here is to compare the organization you're studying with its peers, and then the second goal, of course, is to compare the peers with some sort of international average that you have to consider as well. So let's say you were comparing a school in Toronto with its peers in Toronto. You might want to come up with a Canadian average too, so that you can identify whether or not Toronto is a good place to do schooling compared to the rest of Canada, right? So thinking in terms of comparing your particular organization with its peers, and then the peers with the industry average, or with the economic average, is the key to unlocking this thing. If you can't make any headway at all, then you should probably change your topic. If you can't figure out any way at all to come up with these estimates, then it may make sense to find another topic for the project itself.